By the time I turned into my driveway, the snow had erased the edges of the road, the mailbox was buried halfway up its post, and my 10-year-old daughter was curled beneath the porch roof with her knees pulled to her chest. Lucy's hair was crusted with snow. One mitten was soaked through, and when I knelt beside her, her fingers felt frighteningly cold against mine. Her lips had a faint bluish cast that made every thought in my head disappear except one: get her warm. Through the front window, behind the daughter my parents had left outside, I could see my younger sister Brittany's boxes stacked across my living room. One was marked kitchen. Another said office. My mother, Diane, stood inside the house I owned and told me Brittany needed it more than we did. When I asked if she had known Lucy was outside, she looked straight at me through the locked storm door and said, "She'll survive." I didn't scream. I didn't threaten her. I looked at my daughter, looked back at my mother, and said, "Okay." A few minutes later, I made one call. Before sunrise, my parents were calling me over and over, begging me to answer. Before I tell you how my family got to the point where they thought they could lock my child out of my own house during a Minnesota snowstorm, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what I believed was one terrible decision that night turned out to have been planned much earlier than I realized, and if you enjoy stories about family boundaries, consequences, and people finally being forced to live with the choices they make, please subscribe to the channel and keep listening. At the time, though, I knew none of that. All I knew was that Lucy had called me from our front porch, sounding colder and more frightened than I had ever heard her. The school district had announced an early dismissal that afternoon because the storm was worsening faster than forecast. I worked as a senior compliance analyst for a regional health insurer, about 35 minutes from home on a normal day, and the moment the alert came through, I closed my laptop, told my manager I was leaving, and headed for the parking garage. Diane and Kenneth, my parents, were also registered to receive Lucy's dismissal alerts because they lived in the attached in-law suite on my property and had served as backup pickup contacts for years. I didn't think anything of that then. Having them nearby had once felt practical. The drive home was already ugly before I reached the highway. Snow blew sideways across the lanes, traffic slowed to a crawl, and every few minutes brake lights flared red through the white. About 20 minutes into the drive, my phone connected through the car, and Lucy's name appeared on the display. I answered hands-free. "Mom?" Her voice was shaking so badly that I first thought she was crying. "I'm coming, baby. Where are you?" "At home." "Inside?" There was a pause, then static. "No, the code doesn't work." I gripped the steering wheel harder. "Try your key." I did. The call broke apart before I could ask anything else. I called back twice. The first attempt failed. The second went straight to voicemail. I wanted to pull over, but there was barely a shoulder visible beneath the snow, and stopping on that stretch of road would have been more dangerous than continuing. A minute later, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't play it while driving. I just kept moving, slower than I wanted, feeling that awful pressure of knowing my child needed me while the weather reduced everything to 15 miles an hour and blurred taillights. When I finally turned onto our road, visibility had dropped enough that I almost missed my own driveway. Our house sat on the outer edge of the suburb, where the lots widened and neighbors were farther apart than in the newer developments closer to town. Usually I liked the quiet. That afternoon, the distance between houses suddenly felt enormous. I saw Lucy before I had fully stopped. She was sitting on the porch floor, tucked into the corner beside a planter we had forgotten to bring inside before winter. Her backpack rested beside her, dusted white. I threw the car into park, grabbed the emergency blanket I kept behind the passenger seat, and ran to her. "Mom." That single word nearly broke me. I wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and put both hands against her cheeks. She was awake and responsive, but she was shaking violently. Her jeans were wet around the calves where snow had soaked through, and one of her mittens felt almost saturated. "How long have you been out here?" "I don't know." "Did you call Grandma?" I rang the bell. "Did she answer?" Lucy looked toward the door. "Grandpa came near it." That made me stop. "What do you mean?" I could see his shadow through the side glass. Then Grandma came too. I told them it was me. Our front door had a narrow, frosted sidelight. You couldn't see details through it, but from the porch you could tell when someone moved close. "Did they say anything?" Lucy swallowed. Grandma said to wait. I got her into the passenger seat, turned the heat up, and wrapped another blanket around her legs. I checked her hands again. Her fingers were cold and stiff, and she said the tips felt numb. Her lips were pale with a bluish tint that I did not like at all. Stay here. I'm right outside. I was not going into that house to argue. I only needed to understand what was happening before I called for help. The first thing I noticed at the door was the keypad. I entered my code once. Red light. I entered it again more carefully. Red light. Then I used my key. It went into the cylinder but would not turn. For a second, I simply stared at it. My father knew locks. Kenneth had spent most of his career doing municipal facilities maintenance, and he had helped me replace that exact hardware after a package theft problem 2 years earlier. He also had secondary access to the smart lock system for maintenance emergencies. Someone had changed both the code and the physical cylinder. I stepped to the front window. That was when I saw Brittany's things. Not one suitcase. Not an overnight bag thrown together because the roads were bad. Boxes. Several of them. A floor lamp I recognized from her apartment stood beside my sofa. A rolling garment rack had been pushed against the dining room wall. One box was labeled Brittany Kitchen in black marker. Another said, Office. Brittany herself walked through the hallway carrying a folded blanket. I knocked hard. A few seconds later, Diane appeared. She opened the solid inner door but left the glass storm door locked between us. Open the door. Her expression tightened. Morgan, don't start. Lucy was outside. I know. Those 2 words landed harder than if she had denied it. You knew? She got home earlier than expected. The school dismissed early. You got the alert. Diane waved one hand as if I were arguing about a delayed dinner reservation. Brittany needed to get settled before the weather got worse. Behind her, I could see Kenneth near the hallway. He looked at me, then toward the floor. Open the door, I said again. Diane didn't move. Brittany can't keep bouncing around, she said. Her marriage is over, her business is struggling, and she needs stability. You have options. I almost laughed because the statement was so absurd. Options? You and Lucy can stay at a hotel for a few nights. We can figure out the details when everyone calms down. I looked past her at my own living room, at my sister's boxes occupying space I had never offered her, then back toward my car where my daughter sat wrapped in blankets because 3 adults had decided she was the inconvenience. Did you know she was standing out here in this weather? I asked. Diane exhaled impatiently. She'll survive. Kenneth finally looked up. He still did not unlock the door. Something inside me went completely quiet. There had been plenty of times in my life when my mother had told me Brittany needed more help because I was stronger. Plenty of times I had walked away from an argument because I decided the argument wasn't worth my energy. That habit had probably taught Diane something dangerous about me. She had confused my refusal to fight over every insult with an inability to draw a line. I looked at her and said, Okay. Her shoulders loosened. She thought she had won. I turned away before she could say anything else. Walked back to my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Lucy looked at me with wide, worried eyes. Are we in trouble? No. Is Aunt Brittany living here now? I don't know yet. That answer mattered. I wasn't going to lie to make her feel better, and I wasn't going to make promises before I had facts. I picked up my phone and called emergency dispatch. My 10-year-old daughter has been outside in severe winter weather for somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes, I told the dispatcher. She's conscious, but she's shaking hard, her fingers are numb, and her lips look bluish. The adults inside the residence knew she was outside and refused to let her in. The dispatcher kept me talking while help was sent. I answered every question exactly as asked. I did not call my parents again. I did not call Brittany. I did not call a lawyer. At that moment, none of them mattered as much as Lucy getting warm. While we waited, I glanced toward the porch. The doorbell camera was still mounted beside the door, a small black lens half-rimmed with snow. I had installed it because packages had been disappearing from the neighborhood. Until that moment, I had almost forgotten it was there. Then I realized something. It had been watching the porch the entire time Lucy was outside. The ambulance arrived before the deputy. By then, Lucy had stopped answering every question with a full sentence, not because she was unconscious, but because she was exhausted from shivering. One of the paramedics climbed into my passenger side.
Dinner.
I had
And
passed
every time he offered to help,
Rachel,
Rachel, his younger sister, would deflect with phrases like,
I
"Don't
gave
worry,
time as
Mom's
closed
got
based
it,"
on the
I
school
realized
or
decision.
"We're
then
trying to
that my
keep it
parents
small."
had not
He
panicked
chalked it up
at
to wedding
diagnosis.
stress.
Somewhere
They
between
had
Told
20 and
himself
30 minutes.
not to
They
take
had
it
a script
personally,
ready before
but
Granny
now,
moved in.
seeing it in
They
writing
told the
final,
hospice staff their version of me
Unapologetic,
long
something
before the
inside
first
him
opioid
shifted.
was
And told
prescribed.
me they
Ethan
wanted
didn't
her
respond.
evaluated
I
at the
drove home
He
that
didn't
night
ask why.
and cried in the
He
bathtub
didn't
with the
demand an
water running so
explanation.
the neighbors would
Instead,
hear.
he stood up.
Am I making everyone come out here because I couldn't get inside? She asked. No, I said. You didn't cause any of this. That was the first thing I was certain of that night. I followed the ambulance to the emergency department while a deputy stayed behind at the house. Another met me at the hospital later and took my statement in a small consultation room while Lucy was being warmed and monitored a few doors away. I told him exactly what had happened in order. I told him about the school's early dismissal, Lucy's call, the changed code, the key that no longer worked, Brittany's boxes, and my mother's words through the locked storm door. I did not tell him my mother hated me. I did not tell him my sister was spoiled. I did not tell him I knew why they had done it, because I didn't. Not yet. I gave him facts. When he asked who owned the property, I said, I do. Your parents live there? In the attached in-law suite. They have a written occupancy agreement for that space. And your sister? She does not live there. He nodded and wrote something down. Then he explained that whatever happened with my parents' occupancy would be a separate civil matter. The deputies could document what happened that night, but they were not going to decide who had the right to live where based on an argument in a driveway. That was fine with me. I had not called because I wanted someone to throw my parents into the snow. I had called because my daughter had already been left in it. Once Lucy was stable enough that the nurse was no longer hovering over her every few minutes, I opened the doorbell camera app. The camera had not captured some dramatic view of my parents standing on the other side of the door. It faced outward, toward the porch and driveway, exactly as it was designed to. What it gave me was simpler and, in some ways, worse. Lucy appeared on the recording carrying her backpack while snow blew across the lens. She punched in the code, waited, tried again, then took out her key.
I have been an
When
ICU
that
nurse
failed,
for 8
she
years.
pressed the bell.
I know
Once,
exactly
twice,
what
then
1.5
several more
milligrams per
times.
hour of
She
morphine
leaned
does
close
to
enough
an
to the speaker
82-year-old
that I
woman
could
in
hear her
post-op
voice
day
through the
2.
wind. Grandma,
I
it's
looked at
me.
the IV pump.
A minute later, she said.
I looked at Brenda.
Grandpa?
Brenda
Then
looked
quieter.
at the IV pump.
Please open the
I
door.
said quietly,
I stopped the video.
the way you
I
talk
had
in a
thought
room with a
watching it would
sleeping
make me
patient.
angry.
Brenda,
Instead,
she's
it made
on a
me feel cold
1.5
in a
milligram
completely
morphine
different
drip.
way. The
You
recording
can't
kept
notarize
running
this.
after Lucy backed
You know
into the
you
corner
can't.
under the porch roof.
Right away.
My father
Ethan
rubbed
just
her
sat there
suit
for a
on the
while,
steps of First
phone
Baptist
face
Greer.
down on the table,
Checked her
The
phone.
Purple
letting
Heart
the
on his
silence in
lapel.
his apartment
The
stretch
bright
as far as it
Sunday
needed
sun.
to.
Timestamp confirmed
The stillness
caption
wasn't
was,
uncomfortable.
that
He was
Mama
used
would
to
be
it.
so
He had
proud.
lived most of his life
She
in
let
that
it sit on
same
the
quiet
screen for 10
space
seconds.
emotionally.
Downloaded
At
a
least
copy
even
to
when
my
the rooms
phone and
around him
emailed
were
another
full of
copy
people
to
who
my
shared
phone.
his last name.
My
That
father
was
That
something
message
my
from his
job
dad was a
trained into
ripple,
Then
years
Annabelle
but
ago.
played
not
the
yet a
voicemail.
wave.
If evidence
Not
mattered,
yet.
My
he did
grandmother's
not
voice
Ethan
came
had
out of
learned
the conference
early
room
that
speakers
being
and filled the
quiet
room
was
the way it could
easier
fill
than
the
being
dining.
He did not repeat everyone's full statements to me, and I did not ask him to. He did tell me there was one point I needed to be aware of because it directly involved Lucy. My father had said he believed Lucy would go around to the garage. I stared at the wall across from me. That answer mattered because it meant Kenneth could not later claim he had no idea she was home. He knew she was there. Maybe he had convinced himself there was another way in. Maybe he had wanted to believe she would simply disappear
She
from
did
the
not
problem
ask how
he
I
and my
was.
mother had created.
She said,
Either
Lily,
way,
you
he knew.
embarrassed Mom in
As
front
for
of a
Diane,
hospital nurse.
I did not need a
She'll
deputy
never
to
forgive
establish
you.
what she knew.
Just stay away.
I had asked her
It's better
directly
for
whether
everyone.
she knew Lucy was outside.
I did not
She
call
had
my
answered me
sister again
herself.
for
She'll
26
survive.
months.
By the
In the
time
summer
clock
of
moved toward 4 in the
2024,
morning,
Cassandra
my
texted
phone
me
had
from a
become
coffee
steady
shop in
stream of
Greer.
missed calls and
Lily,
texts.
Granny
Mom,
moved into
call
Mom
me
and Dad's
before this
house
gets
last
blown
week.
out of proportion.
They're saying it's
Dad,
just until she
your
gets
mother
stronger.
panicked. We need to
She's
We
talk.
not
all
going
agreed
back
you're
to
not
Travelers.
welcome.
Tell them you misunderstood what happened. Dad. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Brittany, I didn't know it would go this far. Then another from my mother. Your father could get in serious trouble over this. I read that one twice. Not one of the first messages asked how Lucy was. Not one. My daughter was 10 years old, in a hospital bed being warmed after standing outside our home in a February storm, and the first concern in my family group was not whether she was frightened or hurt. It was whether
I
there
packed
would
my
be
evidence. It's not healthy.
I
I
remember
drove
the total after
135 miles.
I
to
remember
New Haven.
Granny in the doorway
I
with a
texted
shake
Sophia
letter
from the
eased,
parking
though
lot,
she
not
ate
looking
drank
at her
too.
daughter.
I
not
moved my
looking
chair
at me.
closer to the
Sophia,
bed,
walking
almost
past
time.
with the platter to
Here
the
is
table
here
as
too.
if the room
Toward
had
my
been
phone
she
on my
wrote
chair
back.
arm.
See,
Is Grandma
she knew.
calling?
Vamos.
Yes.
She had
At
known.
8:58,
I walked into
Grandma
in
knew.
2009. My grandfather
most of my
Henry
life,
died
I
of
had been
complications. My sister was
from
already
ages
in
and
Orange
smaller.
Boat. Our family that the
Mom was
VA had
stressed and
spent
heartbroken.
35 years.
Dad
The
didn't
committee
come out
was
that way.
assembling on the other.
Brittany was going through something. Everyone had been upset. It was how I kept arguments from growing into wars. That night, I understood what that habit could cost. Yes, I said. She knew you were outside. Lucy's eyes filled, but she did not look surprised. What they did was wrong, I told her. You did not cause it, and you are not responsible for fixing it. She nodded and turned her face into the pillow. I sat there with my hand on her shoulder until she fell asleep again. Only then did I open the Smart Lock app. My father had been given secondary administrative access years earlier because he handled small repairs around the property. I had never worried about it. Kenneth had spent most of his career in municipal facilities maintenance. Locks, doors, hinges, access panels, that was ordinary work to him. I scrolled through the activity history until I found the front door. There it was. The access code had been changed before Lucy's bus arrived. Not after an argument. Not after Brittany showed up unexpectedly. Before. I checked the school's dismissal time, then checked the Smart Lock timestamp again. Someone had changed that code knowing Lucy would be coming home. And for the first time that night, I stopped wondering whether my parents had made one terrible decision. I started wondering how long they had been planning it. I went back to the house the next afternoon, but I did not take Lucy with me. She had been discharged after observation. And although the doctor was satisfied she was recovering normally, she was exhausted and wanted nothing to do with that house for the moment. I respected that. I left her with a close friend of mine who lived nearby and drove over with one purpose: get what we needed, document the condition of the property, and stop making decisions while angry. The storm had moved through by then, leaving the neighborhood buried under heavy snowbanks and dirty piles along the roads. The driveway had been partially cleared. My father had always been quick with a shovel. That detail almost made me laugh, because there was something absurd about him maintaining the driveway of a house he had just tried to lock me out of. I parked near the garage and waited until the friend I had asked to come as a witness pulled in behind me. I did not think my parents were going to attack me. I wanted someone there because I had already learned how fast a family disagreement could become 3 different stories. The main door was unlocked when we arrived. Kenneth had restored the old code sometime that morning, apparently hoping that would make what happened look less deliberate. It did not. Brittany's boxes were still stacked through the living room and dining area, though there were fewer than the night before. A garment rack stood against the wall, and several kitchen items had already been unpacked onto my counters. My mother came out of the hallway before I reached the stairs. "You brought a witness?" "I brought someone while I collect my things." "That's dramatic." I looked at her. Lucy spent part of the night in the hospital. Diane folded her arms. "And she's fine." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about the conversation we were not going to have that day. "I'm here for clothes, school things, and some documents," I said. "I'll be speaking to an attorney before we discuss anything else." My father appeared from the lower hallway. He looked older than he had the night before, but not defeated, mostly irritated. "You don't need a lawyer to talk to your own parents." "No," I said. "I need one because my own parents changed the locks on my house." Kenneth's jaw tightened. "This was my house before it was yours." There it was. I had heard versions of that sentence before, usually softened by nostalgia. "Your mother picked those cabinets. I rebuilt that deck. I planted those maples." None of that was false. My father had put years of work into the house. But standing there, I realized he had been carrying something else underneath those memories. I walked past him toward the hallway. Near the doorway to the kitchen, faint pencil marks still climbed one section of trim. M11, B6, another line, 2 years higher. My father had measured Brittany and me there when we were children. I had seen those marks hundreds of times. That afternoon, they pulled me 6 years backward. In 2020, my parents had been in real financial trouble. At the time, they told me it was a combination of bad timing, reduced income, old debt, and a home equity balance that had gotten away from them. I had no reason to believe they were lying about the basic situation. The numbers were bad enough that if nothing changed, they were going to lose the house. I was 32 then, raising 4-year-old Lucy, working in compliance, and earning enough to qualify for a conventional mortgage. I had saved carefully for years. I did not swoop in with a suitcase of cash. I did not give my parents a house. I bought it. The purchase price was around $340,000. I put roughly $40,000 down, financed the rest, and took title in my name. Their mortgage and secured debt were paid through the closing process, and they moved into the attached in-law suite under a written month-to-month occupancy agreement. They paid me a modest amount each month and covered their own daily expenses and utilities. I paid the mortgage, property taxes, and structural insurance because I was the owner. At the time, I had considered it a practical solution. My parents kept a roof over their heads. I acquired a property I could afford. Lucy and I had more space. Everyone knew where the lines were. At least, I thought everyone did. I had not spent the next 6 years behaving as if the house still belonged to Kenneth and Diane. When my mother wanted to redo the kitchen cabinets, I told her to ask me before hiring anyone. When my father wanted to build a shed, I required him to check permit requirements first. When Brittany once asked if she could store furniture in the garage for a few months, I said no because I needed the space. My parents complained sometimes, but they accepted it. That was the mistake I had made in judging the situation. I thought resentment that stayed verbal was manageable. I thought clear paperwork and occasional pushback were enough. I had mistaken quiet resistance for acceptance. I went upstairs, packed Lucy's school clothes, my work laptop, medication, and a few essentials. I photographed the boxes in the main house and the areas where Brittany's things had already been placed. I did not touch her belongings. I did not throw anything outside. I was too angry to give anyone the satisfaction of calling me reckless. Later that afternoon, I sat in a small conference room with a property attorney whose office had handled straightforward landlord issues for several people at my company. I brought the deed, the occupancy agreement, proof of the monthly payments my parents made, and screenshots from the lock system. He read longer than I expected. So they live in this suite under a month-to-month written arrangement? Yes. And they've paid consistently? Yes. And your sister has no written agreement? Non. He nodded. Then there are 2 separate issues here. One is what happened to your daughter. The other is who has what occupancy rights. Do not mix them by trying to solve the second one yourself. I'm not planning to. Good. No shutting off utilities, no removing their property, no locking them out of the suite.
Then I
while their
noticed the woman
occupancy is still in
standing
effect.
2 feet
I
behind
understand.
Patty.
He
Light
tapped the
blue
agreement
scrubs.
with one finger.
Name
But
tag
this
Brenda
document
Markham,
also does not give them
RN.
authority to assign your portion
I
of the
didn't
property
recognize
to
her
someone
from this
else.
floor. She
If you
wasn't a
decide you
circulating
no longer
nurse.
want this arrangement,
She wasn't a charge
we
nurse,
can give written notice
but she had a
and
notary
end it
stamp in her
promptly.
hand.
I looked
A
at the
lot
page
of
in front
South
of
Carolina
me.
nurses pick up a
6 years
notary
earlier,
commission
my
for
father had joked
$50
about
of
the
side
agreement.
income.
Still making
Patty
your own
had
parents
clearly
sign
arranged it
paperwork,
ahead of
he had
time.
said. I
She had
felt
been waiting
slightly
for the
embarrassed
morphine.
then. Now I was grateful I had. When I returned to the house one more time before leaving for the night, Kenneth was in the workshop area beside the garage. The old lock cylinder sat on the workbench beside a screwdriver set. I pointed at it. That's the one from the front door? He looked at it, then at me. I put it back. That wasn't my question. His face hardened. I knew what I was doing. I know. That was the problem. My father had spent most of his working life maintaining municipal buildings. Locks, access hardware, door closers, damaged hinges, none of it was unusual to him. Years earlier, I had given him secondary access to the smart lock system because it made maintenance easier. He had used something I trusted him with to keep my daughter outside. I removed his administrative privileges for the main portion of the house that evening. I did not interfere with his legal access to the in-law suite. I was not going to become careless just because he had. As I was leaving, Brittany came down the stairs carrying a box marked bathroom. How long are you planning to stay here? I asked. She sighed. I don't know. Try again. At least until my lease is up. I stopped with my hand on my coat zipper. My lease, I repeated. Brittany's expression changed before she could hide it. Diane had spent the previous night telling me my sister had nowhere to go. I looked at Brittany and asked, "How much time is left on your apartment?" For the first time since the storm began, my sister had no answer ready. Brittany finally looked away from me and set the bathroom box down on the floor. 6 weeks, she said. I waited. Maybe a little less by the time all of this is sorted out. So you still have an apartment? Yes, but that doesn't mean it's sustainable. That word told me more than the answer itself. Not impossible. Not unsafe. Not gone. Unsustainable. What does that mean?
60 years,
Your
your
sister
sister will
will
be
have
dismissed
to
from
pay.
medical school.
It means
there
the
was
rent
the
is
singer. She
stupid
will
for
never
what I'm
become a doctor.
getting.
And there was the small cedar
It
box.
means
Is that
there's
what
no
Lily would
shelf.
want? She called.
It means
Lily
half
would
my
want
inventory
both.
is
She never
stacked
let
up
me
or
open
dining
that
room
one.
wall.
Lily
Since
would
I'm
want
paying for a
healing.
place
You'll
that's
know
too
what to
small
do
while
in
trying
the
to keep
important
business
parts when the
alive.
time
And
comes.
you
Family
knew all of
apart.
that 6 weeks
By the
ago.
time I was a
I knew my
teenager,
lease
I
was
had a
ending.
private
It
theory
is
that
not
my
my
mother
mother
hated
question.
this room.
Her
Your father
face
Patty
agrees with
performed
me.
Christianity the way
Morgan,
some
fix
women
this.
perform yoga.
I'm not saying
At
I allowed
11:23,
everything,
when
but
the
my
father
father
texted
you
me
moved
separate in
boxes
front of
into
the
my
right
house
people.
without asking me. Mom said she talked to you. She didn't. Brittany gave me a frustrated look, as if the distinction irritated her more than the lie itself. She said you knew I was having trouble. I knew you were getting divorced. I knew the staging business was slow. I did not know you were planning to move into my house. I wasn't trying to take your house. You were carrying your things into rooms labeled for you. That was temporary. How temporary? She didn't answer. I leaned against the kitchen counter and forced myself not to fill the silence for her. For years, that had been one of my worst habits with Brittany. If she hesitated long enough, someone else would supply the excuse she needed. My mother had turned it into an art form. Eventually, Brittany sighed. I wasn't renewing my lease. Why? Because I can't justify the rent and the business expenses. Then reduce the business. Her eyes flashed. You make that sound simple. I didn't say simple. I've put 4 years into it. And I'm not going to throw that away because I'm having one bad year. I almost pointed out that the business had been struggling longer than 1 year, but I stopped. That argument was not mine to win. What happens if you keep the apartment? I asked. I'd have to sell inventory, take fewer jobs, maybe get a regular job. There it was. Not homelessness. Consequences. So, you had somewhere to sleep last night. Brittany's mouth flattened. That's not the point. It was exactly the point. I left before Diane could join the conversation and turn Brittany's preferences into a family emergency. That evening, after Lucy was asleep beside me at my friend's house, I opened the family group chat and scrolled backward. The thread was mostly ordinary garbage I had ignored for months. Grocery coupons from Mom, weather warnings from Dad, Brittany sending photos of houses she staged, Lucy's school pictures. Then I found what I was looking for. 6 weeks earlier, Brittany had written, "My lease runs through the end of next month. I'm not renewing. I need to figure something else out." Mom replied almost immediately, "We'll have you settled before then." At the time, I had assumed settled meant a new apartment, maybe temporary help moving. I had not answered because there was nothing to answer. A few messages later, Kenneth wrote something about clearing part of the garage. I scrolled farther. On the day of the storm, at 1:17 p.m., Mom had written, "School is letting Lucy out early. Weather's getting worse fast." That message mattered. It meant Diane had not been surprised when Lucy arrived. I saved a screenshot. Then I kept reading. Nothing in the group chat said, "We are moving Brittany into Morgan's house today." They were not that stupid, but the pieces were there if you knew what they meant. A week earlier, Kenneth had written that he needed to make room for winter storage in the garage. 2 days later, Brittany had replied, "Thanks, Dad. I'll bring the rest over before the weekend." The rest? I had never noticed that word. The next morning, I went back to the property while my parents were both in the in-law suite. I did not search Brittany's private things. I did not open sealed boxes. I checked the garage and storage area I owned and had a right to inspect. Several boxes had shipping labels and store receipts taped to the sides. Dates from the previous week. A folding disc, 2 lamps, kitchen equipment, a printer stand, not an emergency overnight bag. They had been moving Brittany in gradually and hiding the process inside the normal clutter of winter. I remembered telling Kenneth a week earlier that the garage looked crowded. Seasonal storage, he had said. I had accepted the answer because there had been no reason not to. That was becoming a pattern I disliked. Not that I had ignored obvious warning signs. That would have been easier to blame on myself. It was that the people I trusted had used ordinary explanations for things that were not ordinary. Brittany arrived around noon in her SUV. She looked exhausted and angry. Are you photographing my stuff now? I'm documenting what's in my property. You're making everything sound criminal. I didn't say criminal. You don't have to. It's all over your face. I lowered my phone. Who decided yesterday was move-in day? She looked toward the in-law suite. That isn't an answer. Mom said we needed to do it before the weather got worse. Why yesterday? Because I had time. That's not what I asked. Brittany opened the back of her SUV and started rearranging a few bags. Mom had been texting all morning. About the roads, the school, your work, everything. I stayed still. About my work? She knew you were still downtown. I wasn't downtown. I was at the office. You know what I mean. No, I don't. Brittany slammed the hatch harder than necessary. She said traffic would be bad and you'd be late. Dad was handling the door. I was supposed to get the rest of my stuff in. The rest. She immediately realized what she had said. How much was already here? I don't know. You moved it. Not all at once. Show me the texts. Her expression changed. No. Why not? Because they're private. You just told me Mom was coordinating when I would be away from my own house. I told you she was worried about the storm. That's not what you said. I'm not handing you my phone. I could have pushed harder. I didn't. The existence of those messages was now established. Brittany had told me herself they existed. If she refused to show them, that was her choice. I filed the fact away. When Diane came upstairs later that afternoon, her explanation had changed. Brittany was no longer about to have nowhere to go. Now she needed stability. She can't run a business out of that tiny apartment, Diane said. That isn't my responsibility. You have more room than you need. That doesn't make it hers. You and Lucy have the whole main house. Because I bought it. Diane's face tightened. There you go again with that. With what? Making everything about whose name is on a piece of paper. I stared at her. That sentence was almost useful because it was finally honest. This isn't about paper, I said. It's about the fact that you decided Brittany's inconvenience mattered more than Lucy's safety. Diane shook her head. You're being dramatic. Nobody wanted Lucy hurt. You still didn't open the door. Because if we had, you would have come in right behind her and started a fight. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Clarity. They had not lost control. They had made a choice. Later, when I picked Lucy up, she sat quietly in the passenger seat for most of the drive. Then she asked, Was Aunt Brittany going to sleep in my room? I looked at her.
But where all of the difference?
Her eyes
Lily, she
dropped in her
said,
hands.
on the evening of
Because
April
walking out,
7th, the night that was away, she said everything
Juliet
important
called
to me.
me.
Slow, her voice was
Brittany
broken but
called
cracked
me.
and won.
She sounded defensive.
Elizabeth, she did
before I
not
said
repeat
hello.
herself. I will lose
need you to
everything. If you weren't paying attention,
I will lose Yale.
The lesson moved on with my
Mom thought once
future.
I was
Over the
already
next
there.
20 years,
23
she
years
walked me
old.
through
I made
what
a
was in the
mistake.
cedar box on
She
the
read
table.
things
I
online.
said, and what
She
will
read
one
things.
day be?
Tenants
You did
don't
not
follow.
make a mistake.
I don't know.
Shelf.
She
You
said
wrote
once my
5,000
there
words
were 11
about a
letters
child
my
you
grandfather
saw through
Henry
had written her.
I
I
closed my
unfolded it.
eyes.
Lily, pencil,
My mother had
call
not
this a
matched her
child
landlord
holding the
law
hand of a
overnight.
woman
For
in
14
scrubs.
days,
I had not been
both
ready.
of
them looking at
She
each
had
other. For
learned
14
just
days,
enough
I
to
had been
become
the
a
daughter
daughter
who still
in
hoped
shaky
some
the plan
pencils
was to
letters
move you in
true.
first
For when
and
you
tell me
my
afterward.
mother had just answered
Brittany
the
went
question.
quiet.
Age 9.
That's
I
what you
set
just
the
said.
alarm. I
Your
took a
mom thought you
photograph
calmed
of it
down.
where it lay.
And
Tomorrow
you?
I would drive
closed
100
the
miles
door.
south on
I
I put
thought
the
you were
originals
angry.
in the inner
But
pocket
you
of my
still
Augusta
brought the
Road in
boxes.
Greenville. I went
Yes.
downstairs. I would
The
meet a
whole
woman
family
my grandmother had
was in
been
the
sitting
audience.
across from
Juliet
since I
had
was
been 16
notified by the
days
Yale
old.
committee on
Her voice was different. No irritation. No lectures about fairness. She sounded tired. Morgan, we made one terrible mistake. I did not answer right away. We'll get Brittany's things out, she continued. She'll go back to her apartment. Your father will apologize to Lucy. I will too. We can put this behind us. What do you want? I want you to stop talking about ending our arrangement. There it was. Mom, we've lived there for 6 years. Lucy loves us. Your father built half that house. Don't destroy everything over one awful night. I thought about Lucy asking whether Grandpa would have to leave. For the first time since the storm, I wondered whether there was a version of this where Brittany left. My parents stayed in the suite under stricter rules. and Lucy did not lose her grandparents along with her sense of safety. I did not say yes, but I also did not say no, and for a few hours, I honestly thought my mother might be right about one thing. Maybe it had been one terrible mistake. For most of the
Marilyn,
next day,
we all
so
agreed
my
you're
sister
not
and my
welcome
mother
at the
probably
wedding.
would
3
have
days
No
found
later, the
punctuation,
hospice
no
coordinator
explanation.
from interim
I
health
Just that
care
just
smug
letting
little
them tell
dash
me.
she
Not
always
because I had
used in
forgotten
place of
Lucy
a
on the
period.
porch.
Southern
Not
Care
because I
Ethan stared at
believed
the
my
minutes
mother's
message,
version
later,
of
unsure
your
if his
parents
eyes were playing
identified
tricks on
that
him.
the patient's
He
emotional
read it again.
stability.
Then
Certain
again.
family
The
members
words
should
didn't
not
change.
visit
It
unannounced.
It wasn't entirely a shock,
I'm so
though.
I considered
sorry.
it because
The signs
Lucy
had
was
been
a
more
family
subtle,
decision.
accumulating
That was
over
the part
months.
anger did not
He
make
hadn't
I
been
sat in the
included in the
parking
group
lot of
photo
Walgreens
planning,
with the call
hadn't
on the
received an
dashboard.
invite to the
Grandpa
engagement.
twice. The second time, we were sitting at my friend's kitchen table while she worked on a worksheet the school had posted online because roads were still bad. Does Grandpa have to move out? I looked up from my coffee. I haven't decided yet. She traced the edge of her paper with one finger. He taught me how to use the little screwdriver set. I know, and he makes pancakes better than you. That is objectively false. She smiled a little, which was the first time I had seen her do that since the storm. That smile was enough to make me slow down. I did not want Lucy carrying the burden of deciding what happened to her grandparents. But I also did not want to make a permanent decision just because I was furious and scared. So I called the attorney. I want to ask you something before we send anything final, I said. He waited. If my sister leaves completely, could we keep my parents in the suite under stricter terms? Legally, you can continue the arrangement if you want to. I mean, with tighter rules. We can draft tighter rules. I listed them. No access to the main house unless I approved it. No changing locks or access codes. No allowing anyone else to live anywhere on the property. No using the garage for Brittany's business. No involvement in Lucy's transportation unless I specifically authorized it. Any future violation would end the arrangement. He listened, then said, I can draft that. But I want to be clear about something. What? A stronger agreement only helps if you're prepared to enforce it. I leaned back in the chair.
Anything else in your family's
I replied
possession?
with one
sentence.
believed
Anything
that was
physical?
enough.
Actually
That
connected
afternoon,
to call
Brittany
Grandma's
came back
lawyer
from
and
work
I knew the
asking
she
answers.
really trusted.
She did
I
not
just
bring
did not
moving
know
next
where it
morning.
was.
She
It wasn't
loaded
my
her
lawyer
SUV
who called.
herself,
I called.
box
It was
by
there at
box,
night.
carrying
His
kitchen
voice
items,
had not
a
called her in
printer,
4
2
months.
lamps, and the
We
folding
needed
desk
picked up
I had
nervous.
seen in the garage.
Right the way
now.
she always
Diane
picked
stood
up.
near
They
the
did
doorway
not
in
recognize the
time.
number on the
They
screen.
had no idea
but
that
every
was
cruel
name.
thing they did in
This
that
is
hospice
ridiculous,
room.
she said
I
after
had been
the
watching
trip.
them the
I
whole
need to
time.
ask you something.
My
You don't
name
have
is
to
really
meet my
my
mother
mother
in
in
person.
person. 33.
I looked at my mother. She carried it in. That's not the point. I almost smiled. Apparently nobody in my family knew what the point was anymore. Brittany came back inside, breathing hard. I'm taking everything I can today. Good. She stopped and looked at me. You don't have to sound happy about it. I'm not happy. You could have helped. I could have. Her face tightened. For years, that would have been the moment I stepped in just to make things easier. I would have grabbed a box because I was standing there anyway. I would have told myself it cost me nothing. That afternoon I stayed exactly where I was. Not because I wanted Brittany to suffer, because carrying her own belongings back to the apartment she still had was not suffering. It was simply something she was capable of doing. Diane watched me the way people look at someone who has broken an unspoken rule. Maybe I had. Later, while I was checking messages from work, Brittany's name appeared on my phone. She had sent a screenshot. No explanation. Just one image from a text conversation with Mom. Dad wants everything in before Morgan gets home. That was all. I stared at the sentence. The timestamp was from the day of the storm. I called Brittany. She answered on the 4th ring. What is this? You kept asking whether it was planned. I asked to see the messages. That's the only one I'm sending. Why? Because I'm not getting dragged into some war between you and Mom. You were moving into my house? I know. Then you're already in it. She exhaled sharply. I sent you what I sent you. Why did Dad want everything in before I got home? I don't know. You do. I know what Mom told me. What did she tell you? That once the stuff was there, you'd stop being difficult about it. I looked at the screenshot again. Anything else? No. I did not believe her. But I also did not push harder. There was a strange value in people choosing what they revealed. Sometimes the shape of what they refused to show told you almost as much as what they sent. I saved the screenshot. Then I went back to the agreement draft my attorney had emailed. I read through every line. For the first time since the storm, the future looked almost manageable. Brittany would leave. My parents would stay in their suite. The main house would be off limits. Lucy would not be alone with them. Everything would be written. Clean. Structured. Controlled. That kind of solution appealed to me because it matched the way I understood problems. Define the risk. Reduce the exposure. Document the boundary. Move forward. Before I signed anything, though, I wanted the original purchase documents from 2020 inches front of me, partly because I wanted to make sure nothing in the old closing package conflicted with the revised agreement, partly because the sentence my father had used kept bothering me. This was my house, before it was yours. I had heard nostalgia in it. Now I wondered if I had missed resentment. I pulled the old closing folder from the fireproof cabinet in my home office. The papers were exactly as boring as I remembered. Title documents, loan disclosures, insurance, settlement statements, payoff figures. I had seen all of it 6 years earlier. Back then, I had been focused on whether I could afford the mortgage, whether the title was clean, whether my parents would be able to stay, whether Lucy and I could make the arrangement work. I had not been studying their failures. I had been solving a problem. This time I read differently. One line stopped me. A home equity lien. Not tiny. Not some leftover credit line. Large enough that I sat forward and checked the number again. I went back through the payoff section. Then I pulled up the notes I had made around the time of closing. My parents had told me the house was in trouble because bills had piled up after my father's reduced hours and because a few debts got away from us. That was how Mom phrased it. A few debts.
Through
lien on the
hospital
page did not look
security
like a
under
few
the
debts.
Internal
It
Volunteer
looked like a
Coordination
decision.
Audit Policy.
I kept reading.
She had been at
The
Boston
borrowing
Children's
hit me
24
next.
years.
I knew that year.
They trusted her.
Everyone in the family
The first
knew that
file
year.
was my
It
Patient
was the
Navigator
year
Law.
Brittany's first business.
3,200 total
Built-in
hours
intelligence,
across
battery
all
saves
day
power,
club.
and updates are automatic.
1,180
So
of
each
those
work
hours were
interrupts you.
specifically with Lily Donovan
Dell
and her
Pro
mother.
And then somehow recovered
Bedside
enough to keep
reading,
operating.
translation,
At the time,
family
Mom
conferences,
had said Brittany had found a
hospice
way
support.
through.
We're Phoenix
After
Energy,
hours
a
visits,
family-owned.
I negotiated vendor terms, maybe a small business loan, maybe help from someone she knew. I had never asked. Why would I? It was not my business. Now I had a home equity lien in front of me from the same period. I checked the date again. Then the closing timeline. Then the month my parents first told me they might lose the house. The events that had always existed in separate parts of my memory started moving toward each other. Brittany's business crisis. My parents' debt. The home equity borrowing. My purchase of the house. I felt something in my chest go very still. I called Brittany again. She answered with obvious irritation. What now? I looked at the lien amount. 6 years ago, when your first business almost failed, how much money did Mom and Dad put into it? Silence. I waited. Brittany? Still nothing. And that silence lasted just long enough for me to understand that whatever answer came next was going to change the story I had been telling myself for 6 years.
Phone
Brittany
lit up
finally
again.
We're going to
exhaled
play
into the
3
phone.
A
things.
message.
Why are you
Annabelle
This
asking
said.
me
time,
about that now?
it wasn't
we're
from
going to talk.
Because
Marilyn.
I'm looking at the
It
home
wasn't
equity
from
She
lien
started
Rachel.
to hear your
clip 3.
It
business
wasn't
almost
even
My
from one
mother
of the
watched
cousins,
That
herself.
doesn't mean anything.
who
On a
likely had
wall
no
mounted
idea what
screen,
had just
Mom and Dad
happened.
against the house.
It was from his father,
Slide her
Thomas
own
Miller.
mother's
You
engagement
You
ring
around?
off her
Another
own
pause.
I think you
mother's
should see
finger.
something.
The
Just
audio
that.
was perfectly
7
clear.
words.
I don't
No
It's okay,
drama,
Mama.
no
I'm just
emotion.
gonna look at
remember
it.
enough to know
Just a
whether
quiet
it's
flag in the wind,
$1,000 or
signaling
mother
that
opened
whatever
her mouth,
Ethan had
her voice
assumed about the
sharpened.
boundaries of this
Why
family
that's
fracture.
irritating me like I stole it. I'm asking a question. They offered. That wasn't the question. She went quiet again, and I had to make myself stay quiet too. I had spent too much of my life rescuing people from uncomfortable silences. Finally, she said, Dad called it an investment. In what? My business. How much? I don't know. Maybe 40,000. Maybe more by the time everything was paid. I looked back at the closing documents spread across my desk. The lien itself did not tell me where the money had gone. It proved that the debt existed and that it had to be paid off when I bought the house. Nothing more. I knew better than to turn one financial document into a conclusion it could not support. What did they pay? I asked. Some vendor balances, a line of credit, payroll for a while. For your business. Yes. I closed my eyes. Brittany immediately started defending herself. I never told them to risk the house. I didn't say you did. Mom said they could afford it. Could they? I don't know what their finances looked like. You knew enough to take the money. That is not fair. What part? I was 27. The business was collapsing. I had employees, contracts, people depending on me. So did they. That was their choice. There it was again. Choice when Brittany benefited. Obligation when I refused. I looked at the payoff numbers from 2020 and remembered how frantic my parents had been when they called me. My father had said the mortgage had become impossible. My mother had talked about reduced income, old bills, interest, bad timing. None of those things had been entirely false. Kenneth's hours had dropped for a period. They did have other debt, but they had left out the largest decision, tying everything together. Did they tell you not to tell me? I asked. Brittany hesitated. Yes. My hand tightened around the phone.
Who?
Mum. What did she say? That you'd judge me. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. So I was allowed to buy the house after the damage was done. I just wasn't allowed to know what caused the damage. That's not how it happened. Then tell me how it happened. Brittany's voice lowered. I was in trouble. They wanted to help. Then their finances got worse. You offered to buy the house. That's it. No, that's the version where every event happens by itself. She did not answer. Do you still have any of those messages? What messages? From Mom, from 2020. I don't know. You just remembered what she said. That doesn't mean I saved every text for 6 years. Fine. I was about to end the call when she said, Wait. I heard movement on her end. Then the soft tapping of her screen. I backed up my old phone when I changed devices. I said nothing. Give me a minute. The first screenshot arrived while we were still connected. It was an old conversation between Brittany and Mom. The date matched the period I had already identified. Brittany, I can't cover the vendor invoices and payroll both. Mom, your father and I talked. We'll use the equity. Brittany, are you sure? Mom, you're our daughter. We're not going to watch you lose everything. Another screenshot came through. Brittany, what if Morgan asks why the house debt is so high? Mom, she doesn't need to know what caused the mess. She'll only make you feel worse. I read that sentence twice. Brittany spoke before I did. I'm sending those because I want you to understand that I didn't force them. I understand. They chose it. I understand that too. I didn't know it would eventually mean they couldn't keep the house. That, I believed. Brittany had been selfish more than once in her life, but I did not think she had sat at 27 calculating how to destroy our parents' finances so I would someday buy the property. Real people did not usually build disasters that neatly. They made a series of convenient decisions and then acted surprised when all the consequences met in the same room. I spread the documents across my desk and reconstructed the sequence. My parents borrowed against the house. A large portion went into Brittany's failing business. Their total secured debt climbed. Other financial problems followed. They could no longer sustain the payments. Then I bought the house, allowing those debts to be paid through closing and allowing them to remain in the property. 6 years later, Brittany's life was unstable again, and my parents had once again decided the house should absorb the consequences. The first time, they had risked their ownership. The second time, they no longer owned it, so they had tried to use mine. That was the moment the entire story changed for me. Until then, part of me had still been trying to separate the storm from everything that came before it. I could imagine a version where Diane panicked because Brittany was struggling, Kenneth made one unforgivable decision with the locks, and all of us created new boundaries afterward. The numbers on my desk told me that version was too generous. I called Brittany back. She answered quietly. I'm not asking you to repay that money, I said. I couldn't. I know. That business barely survived anyway. I'm not collecting the past.
About to
She
fold.
said nothing. I'm
You just
stopping
made
it
an
from
enemy
happening
of this
again.
family.
What does
2
that
weeks
mean?
later, my
It means
father
you're not
emailed
moving
me
into
a
my
single
house. You're not
paragraph
using the garage.
informing me
I'm
I
not
was no
financing the
longer
business.
welcome
I'm
at
not
family
co-signing
gatherings
anything.
until I
And Mom and
apologized
Dad are
for the
not
scene
staying
at
under
the
a revised
hospital.
arrangement.
I did
Her
not
voice changed.
apologize.
You
I
were going
started
to let
no
them stay?
contact on a
I was
Tuesday in
considering
early
it.
September of
Because of Lucy?
2023.
Yes.
What I did not
And now
know,
you're not.
what
No.
nobody told me
Morgan,
until
that
2.5
money was 6
years
years ago.
later,
The money
was
is
that
6 years
2
old.
weeks
The decision
after
isn't. What is that supposed to mean? It means the same rule keeps getting applied. You struggle, they decide something belonging to someone else should fix it. That's not fair. Neither was putting a 10-year-old outside because her room was useful to you. I didn't put her outside. You knew I had not agreed to any of this, and you moved in anyway. She went silent. I did not need her to confess to more than she had done. After the call, I opened the revised occupancy agreement my attorney had drafted. 2 days earlier,
On my little sketchpad, my ID badge was. It showed me sitting in a chair. I had pulled my phone out, only to check the time.
Clear lines.
On the subject
now
line, Lily had written voice, typed in lawyer shaky handwriting, 5 words. Final terms for the return of mom's belongings.
They had crossed
Lily,
them
please
because
read
they
in
believed
full
need
before
gave them
responding. I
permission.
said, I set the
called
copy
my
out
attorney.
before I read the
I'm
first
not signing
line.
the revised agreement.
There was a long
cadence
cadence of
Alright.
her language,
I
even
want
in
to
print.
continue
She
with
started
termination.
crying
She had
very
been a Sunday
quietly
school
into the
teacher
phone.
written
First
notice
batch she
based on the
career for
existing
22
month-to-month
cielo.
arrears. I want it done correctly. It will be. No shortcuts. I understand. When the draft arrived later that afternoon, I read every line before approving it. I was not throwing anyone into a snowbank. My parents would have lawful notice and time to find somewhere else. If they chose to fight the process, I would deal with that process too. But the decision itself was made. That evening, Diane called. I almost let it go to voicemail, then answered because I wanted to hear whether there was anything left in her explanation that I had missed. She did not ask about Lucy. She said, "Brittany told me what you found." I'm sure she did. You went digging through 6-year-old paperwork just to punish us. I opened the closing file for the house I own. We helped your sister. You borrowed against the house to do it. She was drowning. And you didn't tell me before I bought the property. Why would we? You would have judged her. I was the person taking on the mortgage. You were buying a house. I was also solving the financial crisis you asked me to solve. Diane's voice hardened. So what exactly did you want us to do back then, Morgan? I waited. She said it as if the answer were obvious. Let your sister fail? That was when I understood there was nothing left to negotiate. My mother did not think the choice she had made in 2020 was part of the problem. She thought the problem was that I had finally stopped agreeing to pay for it. The written notice went out 2 days later. I read it 3 times before my attorney sent it. Not because I wanted to find a loophole, but because I wanted the opposite. I wanted every date clean, every requirement followed, every step boring enough that nobody could later pretend I had acted in a rage. My parents' month-to-month occupancy would end at the close of the proper rental period. They had time to find another place. Their utilities stayed on. Their access to the suite remained exactly what the agreement allowed. I did not touch their belongings, change their locks, or interfere with anything they were still legally entitled to use. When Kenneth saw the notice, he called me before my mother did. You're actually doing this. I told you I was. You're ending 6 years over one night. No, I'm ending the arrangement because I no longer trust you with access to my home or my daughter. You make it sound like we're criminals. I didn't say that. You don't have to. He sounded angry, but underneath it, there was something else I had heard more clearly since the storm. Humiliation. I put 30 years into that house, he said. I rebuilt the deck. I finished the basement. I replaced half the plumbing. I planted those trees. I know. You know? Yes. Then how can you stand there acting like none of that means anything? I never said it means nothing. It was my house. It was. The silence on his end hardened. I hate this, he said finally. I hate having to ask my own daughter what I'm allowed to do in a place I built with my hands. That was probably the most honest thing my father had said since Lucy was left outside. Then this was never just about Brittany. He did not answer. I did not need him to. For years, I had treated his complaints as nostalgia. Now, I could hear the pride underneath them. Every time I asked him to check with me before making a change, I thought I was enforcing ordinary property boundaries. He experienced it as a reminder that the final decision belonged to me. That did not excuse what he had done. It did explain why changing the lock had mattered to him. My mother called later that evening. She skipped hello. You're punishing your father for admitting he has feelings about losing his home. It stopped being his home in the legal sense 6 years ago. I still let both of you live there. There you go. Legal sense. Paperwork. Rules. You keep saying that as if rules only exist when they help me. I'm saying family isn't supposed to work like a corporation. No. But family also isn't supposed to take someone else's house, because one daughter is having a harder year than the other. Diane made an impatient sound. You have always been able to handle things. I stopped pacing. She continued before I could answer. Brittany hasn't. That's the difference you refuse to understand. There it was. Not hidden behind fairness. Not wrapped in emergency language. Just the rule she had been using my entire life. Why is she always the emergency? I asked. Because you can handle things. She can't. I looked through the window at Lucy doing homework at the kitchen table of the short-term rental I had taken while I sorted out the house. You hear yourself, right? Oh, please. You're saying the better I manage my life, the more you think I owe her. I'm saying families help the person who needs it. And when does she stop needing it? Diane went quiet for a beat. Then she said, when she's stable. I almost asked who got to decide what stable meant, but I already knew the answer. My mother did. Brittany called me the next morning, furious.
At the wedding, my mom texted me. Smug as ever. No punctuation. Just her signature, dashed like a slap in the face, wrapped in formal tone. I didn't reply. I logged into my account, transferred the $6,500 honeymoon fund back to myself, and canceled the business class flights I booked under her name. No shouting, no drama. Just a quiet little click. By morning, I had 23 missed calls, but only one met.
No. Did Dad force you into the SUV? No. Then Mom did not do all of this by herself. Brittany's voice sharpened. I already told you I handled it badly. No, you keep telling me Mom planned it. That's not the same thing. What do you want from me? I want you to stop using Mom as proof that you had no choice. She did not answer. I was not trying to make Brittany confess to being evil. I did not think she was. But she had spent too many years confusing being influenced with being powerless. If she was ever going to change, even slightly, she had to own the part where she knew I had never said yes and stepped through the door anyway. A few days later, I drove past the property to collect mail and saw my father sitting in his truck with a legal pad on the steering wheel. When he noticed me, he rolled down the window. What are you doing? Looking at apartments. That surprised me. I thought Mom said she wasn't going. She says a lot of things. He tapped the pad. He had written down rents, deposit amounts, distances, parking, whether utilities were included. Kenneth was practical when he allowed himself to be. There's one in Maple Grove, he said. 2 bedrooms, nothing special. Can you afford it? Yes. That answer mattered. My parents were not being made homeless. They were losing a below-market arrangement and a property they had continued to think of as theirs. Those were not the same thing. My mother still refused to discuss apartment listings. According to Kenneth, every place
Brenda
was
put the
too
stamp
small,
back in her
too
bag.
expensive,
She
too
walked
far
out of
from
the room
stores,
without
or
saying a word.
depressing. I
My
stayed out of
mother's
it.
face turned
I
the
also
color
started
of cooked
removing the
beans.
conveniences that had
She
allowed
stood up,
everyone to pretend
smoothed her
boundaries were
cardigan,
flexible.
picked up the
Brittany
folder,
no
and
longer
motioned
stored
me into
anything
the
in my
hallway
garage.
with 2 fingers.
I made it clear
In the
I would
hallway,
not
she did
co-sign
not
a
raise her
lease,
voice.
business loan,
My mother
vehicle,
never
or
raised
credit
her voice in
application.
public.
I would not finance
She
her
leaned
staging
in close
company.
enough that I
I
could
would not
smell
let
her
my
morning
parents
coffee.
expand their use beyond
You
the
don't
street while their
understand what we're
notice
trying to
period
protect her
continued.
from.
But I did not shut
From
off
what,
water.
Mom? Bed at
I did
night.
not
That
cancel
overly
fees.
formal
did it
tone
because
she
she was a
used
good
when she
daughter.
wanted to sound
She did it
above
on
the
an
chaos she often created,
Apple ID that
as though she
uploaded
were a
every
school
minute of
principal
footage
handing
to
down a
family
suspension,
iCloud drive
rather
she
than a
never
mother
logged
cutting
into
out her own
exercise.
son from a family
She had hung
milestone.
a camera in
The
her
room
room,
felt unusually
and then she had
quiet,
pointed it
as if
at
the air
herself.
itself had paused to
Cassandra
see what he would
texted
do
me my
next.
experience was how
But
people
Ethan
announced
didn't
they were
move.
already
trench
involved.
He didn't pace.
Okay.
He didn't write
Your
a
mother
furious
says you're
email or
throwing
call
away
Wanna lose weight
anyone.
without losing muscle?
Instead,
Factor
he
got me
opened
there.
a blank
I
document
was
on
tired
his
of all the
laptop
cutting and bulking
and
cycles.
typed,
3 emails she had ever sent all this
That's
time the
urban.
same way.
Morgan,
I thought you had
they're
it.
your parents.
Your
I know.
father stayed on the phone with
Your
her
father
for
worked on that
43
house
minutes.
for decades.
We're
I
prepared
know
to
that.
give her what your
Happened.
grandmother left for
I
you.
told her about the
But
ales
only
waiting till
after you
summer
cut about
until
Juliet's
I looked at the
essay.
calendar
Face us
on
in
my
about
laptop.
the letter
And
Marlo
waiting
apologized
until
on
summer
video.
sounded harmless
3
when
months.
someone
She
else
listened
suggested
with that was how
speaking.
long
To
my
me,
grandmother
it
had
meant
been the
teaching
trend.
my parents
She
that
said,
if they pushed
I
hard
scrolled. What do you
enough,
need me to
every
do?
boundary
41
eventually
bullet points. I told her I would
points.
call her back.
I read them once the way
there
you
was
read a
something
lab
I had to
report
do for a
first.
patient.
If you want
On
the
the
authentic
evening of
version,
March
I'll
says
send it once.
drug-free
After that,
workplace.
I'm not discussing
Random
it.
testing
Carol
in
went
effect.
quiet. What does
I had
documented
passed my
mean?
December screen
It means
3
I have
weeks earlier.
timestamps,
I
messages,
called my
the
old
log
church
log,
friend
and
Bethany
the
on
actual
speakerphone
timestamp.
and
I
asked
don't
her
need private medical
gently
information
what
about
people
Lucy.
were saying.
I wouldn't send that.
She paused
That
for a long
distinction mattered
time.
to me.
She said,
I was not going to turn my
Patty
daughter's
says you've been
hospital visit
struggling
into
with
family
substances and
entertainment.
toxic
I sent Carol
influences.
only what was necessary.
She says they've had to
The
set
doorbell
hard
timeline,
boundaries to protect
the
Mama.
group chat messages showing Brittany's
Substances
lease had
and
not ended.
toxic influence.
The timestamp showing the access code had been changed before Lucy arrived. Nothing more. By the next day, 2 cousins had texted me. One said I should forgive my parents because they're still mom and dad. The other said he had no idea Brittany still had an apartment. I did not reply to either message. That became my rule. I would not post anything publicly. I would not make a group announcement. I would not circulate Lucy's medical records. But I also would not lie when someone contacted me because Diane had already brought them into the story. For most of my adult life, privacy had meant protecting the family from embarrassment. Now I understood there was another kind of privacy. Protecting Lucy. Protecting myself. Not protecting people from the consequences of facts. A few days later, Aunt Carol called again. Her tone was different. I have one question. Go ahead. If Brittany was really about to be homeless, why did she tell us last month that her lease ran through the end of next month? I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I realized my mother's story had started to break without me doing anything except refusing to hold it together. Aunt Carol was the first person in the family to ask the right question, but she was not the last. Once one inconsistency appeared, the rest of my mother's version became harder to hold together. I did not send everyone a folder or turn my family into a jury. I sent information only to the people who contacted me directly, and only what they needed to understand why I had made the decision I had made. That meant no photographs from the hospital, no details from Lucy's medical chart, no pictures of her blue lips or the warmed blankets around her shoulders. I refused to use the worst moment of my daughter's life as a weapon, even against people who had already decided I was cruel. What I did send was simple: the doorbell timeline showing how long Lucy had remained outside, the family group messages showing that Brittany's lease still had weeks left, the timestamp from the smart lock system showing the front door code had been changed before Lucy's bus arrived, and Brittany's own messages confirming she had not actually lost her apartment. The reactions were exactly as mixed as I expected. One cousin wrote that he understood why I was angry, but said I would regret breaking the family apart. An uncle told me my parents should never have changed the locks, but asked if making them leave was too permanent. Another relative simply sent me a thumbs up and said Diane had been telling people Brittany was facing homelessness, which apparently was the part that surprised him most. Nobody became my cheering section. I preferred it that way. What changed was that people stopped accepting my mother's version automatically. That was enough. Diane noticed. She called Brittany constantly during that period, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. I knew because Brittany told me after one of their conversations went badly enough that she called me immediately afterward. Mom is making this sound like I was living in my car, she said. You weren't. I know. You let her say it for a while. I know that too. There was less fight in her voice than there had been a week earlier. She keeps telling everyone she only did all of this because I had no choice, Brittany said, like I'm some helpless idiot who can't rent an apartment without her. He sat back at my desk. That was new. You told her you still had a lease. She says that doesn't matter because I couldn't afford the life I had there. You could afford a different life. Yeah. The word came out reluctantly. I waited. Brittany said, I've started applying for jobs. I did not congratulate her as if she had performed a miracle. She was 33 years old. Applying for salaried work because her business was no longer supporting her was not heroic. Good, I said. She laughed without humor. You really have changed. No, I'm just not grading you on a curve anymore. She went quiet after that. A few days later, Diane made the mistake of telling Aunt Carol that Brittany had been forced out of her home by the divorce with no warning. Carol knew enough about the situation to question it, because Brittany's divorce had been final for months and the apartment lease came afterward. Suddenly, the lie did not only make me look heartless, it made Brittany look incompetent. That bothered Brittany more than I expected. My whole life, Mom has said she was helping me, she told me. Now I'm listening to how she talks about me to everyone else, and I sound pathetic. I almost told her that was the price of letting someone else build your identity around needing rescue. I did not. She was beginning to understand it without me. Then, one Saturday afternoon in March, my phone buzzed while Lucy and I were grocery shopping. A message from Brittany. I'm sending you the whole thread. I stopped beside a refrigerated case. Lucy was comparing yogurt flavors and did not notice. The next message arrived with several screenshots attached. I already knew the thread existed. Brittany had admitted that weeks earlier. I had seen one fragment where Diane wrote that Dad wanted everything moved in before I got home. What I had never seen was the full sequence. I waited until Lucy and I were back in the car before opening it. The conversation began late on the morning of the storm. Mom, school alert just came through. They're letting Lucy out early. Dad, I saw it. Brittany, should we just wait until tomorrow? Roads are already getting bad. Mom, no. Tomorrow Morgan will be home. That line made me read more slowly. A few messages later, Kenneth wrote, I can change the front code before the bus gets there. Brittany, what if Lucy gets there first? Mom, brain sigh. Morgan's already left work, but traffic is a mess. We need your things in before Morgan gets home. Then, 20 minutes later, Brittany, I still think she's going to lose it. Mom, she always calms down once she has to deal with what's already done. And then the line that made the entire plan click into place. Mom, once you're in, she won't make a scene with Lucy there. She'll figure out the rest later. I stared at the screen. The messages did not say they wanted Lucy hurt. They did not say they planned to leave her in dangerous weather for half an hour. That would have been almost easier to understand because it would have made them monsters in a simple, obvious way. What the messages showed was something colder. They had chosen the day because
part written by my mother
would delay me.
I would have to find that one myself. The honor committee process began on March 4th.
The code before her bus
I
arrived.
drafted a formal request and sent it to Marla.
Already be inside when
I
got
asked
home.
the committee to
And my
compare
mother
my
believed
submitted
Lucy's
personal
presence
statement
would
from the
make me less likely
2025
to
cycle with
She
Juliet's
had not
submitted
expected
personal
Lucy to become
statement
the
from the
reason I stopped
2024
compromising.
cycle,
I drove home
specifically the
without saying
paragraphs
much.
referencing a
Lucy watched
pediatric
the snowbanks
oncology
outside the
patient.
window.
I
Smaller now
attached
than
my
they had
original
been a month
draft document
earlier.
from spring
Gray at
2020.
the edges from road salt and thaw. Once she was inside and busy with a book, I sat at the kitchen table and reconstructed the timeline one more time. The school alert timestamp. The family group message where Diane acknowledged early dismissal. Kenneth's lock change. The private thread. Lucy's arrival on the doorbell footage. My delayed commute. The boxes already in the house. Nothing depended on a single dramatic confession. The pieces simply fit. That was what made it convincing. My parents had not woken up in a panic and made a terrible decision. They had chosen a day when they believed circumstance would do half the work for them. The storm would keep me away. The early dismissal would put Lucy there first. Brittany's boxes would create the appearance that the move had already happened. And once I arrived, my mother expected me to do what I had always done. Assess the mess, contain the damage, make everyone calmer, figure it out. They had planned around my competence. What they had not planned for was what would happen when competence stopped serving them. I sent the screenshots to my attorney and saved copies with the rest of the evidence. I did not forward them to the entire family. I did not call my mother and demand an explanation. By then, I did not need one. The explanation was in writing. Toward the end of March, my attorney confirmed that the end of my parents' notice period was approaching. Kenneth had already toured several apartments and had narrowed the list down. Diane still refused to talk about moving, as if refusing the vocabulary could stop the calendar. Brittany, meanwhile, had taken the first interview for a salaried operations position at a furniture company. She did not sound excited about it, but she sounded less entitled to rescue than she had a month earlier. Then my phone lit up one evening, while I was helping Lucy with a science assignment. Mom, you're really going to make us leave after all this? I read the message once. Then I turned the phone face down and went back to Lucy's homework. For the first time in my life, my mother was discovering what it felt like when a deadline belonged to someone other than her. By the third week of March, Brittany had taken almost everything out of my garage. The last trip was quieter than the others. She came alone, without Mom hovering behind her or Dad trying to explain why certain boxes really belonged with the house. She folded down the back seats of her SUV, loaded the remaining staging inventory, and carried out a pair of lamps she had apparently forgotten were even there. I stood near the garage door and watched her work. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her jeans and looked at me. I should have asked you. I nodded. Yes. She waited like she expected more. I did not give her more. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because there was a difference between accepting an admission and turning it into forgiveness before either of us had earned that. I've got another interview next week, she said. For the furniture company? No, logistics coordinator, better salary. Good. She gave me a tired look. You really aren't going to tell me everything's going to be okay, are you? No. That almost made her smile. I guess that's fair. She closed the SUV hatch. Her business had not disappeared. She was keeping a few clients on weekends and selling off inventory she no longer needed. But for the first time since I could remember, she was making decisions based on what she could actually support instead of what someone else might save for her later. I did not know whether that change would last. It was not my job to make it last. My father was more complicated. Kenneth spent several days telling people he might fight the notice. He never threatened me directly with some dramatic lawsuit, but he wanted me to know he had options. One afternoon he called while I was leaving work. I talked to someone. Okay, they said I could contest this. You can talk to an attorney if you want. You're not worried? I'm prepared to follow the process. That's not what I asked. I know. He went silent. I had learned by then that my father expected resistance to prove he still had leverage. Anger meant the fight mattered. Fear meant he still controlled something. Calm frustrated him more. I'm not just some tenant, he said. You're my father. And you also have a written month-to-month occupancy agreement. He exhaled hard. You really can turn anything into paperwork. No. You turned my house into a power struggle. The paperwork is just the part that doesn't change depending on who's telling the story. He hung up shortly after that. A few days later, he called again. His voice was flatter. We found an apartment. I was standing in a grocery store parking lot when he said it. Where? About 15 minutes away. 2 bedrooms. Can you afford it? Yes. I waited. He added. It's not what we're used to. I almost said that was not the same thing as not being able to live there. I did not need to. What's the move-in date? End of the month. Okay. That word felt different now. My parents had not been pushed to the edge of homelessness. They had found a normal apartment within their means. The real loss was status, space, control. My father would no longer have a workshop the size he wanted. My mother would no longer walk upstairs into my kitchen whenever she felt entitled to comment on how I was raising Lucy. They would have to live within the limits of what their own income bought. Diane called the apartment humiliating. Kenneth called it temporary. I called it theirs. Around the same time, a card arrived addressed to Lucy in my mother's handwriting. I stared at it for nearly a minute before opening the outer envelope. Inside was a simple card with flowers on the front. Grandma hopes one day you understand that families make mistakes when they're scared. I love you. There was no mention of the porch. No mention of the locked door. No apology for leaving Lucy outside. Just a request that one day a 10-year-old girl reinterpret what happened in a way that made Grandma easier to forgive. I put the card in a drawer. I did not throw it away. I also did not hand it to Lucy. That decision belonged to me for now. She was not going to become the judge of whether adults had been punished enough. She was not going to be asked to comfort people who had already decided her discomfort was acceptable. When the final week arrived, I went back to the house more often, mostly for practical reasons. I documented the condition of shared areas. I checked what had been removed. I made sure nothing from the main house had been packed by mistake. But the strangest part was watching my father's workshop empty. Kenneth had built that space himself years before I bought the property. Pegboards covered one wall. Small drawers labeled with his handwriting held screws, anchors, washers, bits of hardware I had no names for. By the end of March, most of it was gone. One afternoon, I found him wrapping a level in an old towel. He looked up. You remember when I taught you to patch drywall? I do. You were terrible at it. I was 12. You used too much compound. I was 12. He almost smiled. For a few seconds, he was just my father. The man who had taught me to fix cabinet hinges. The man who had shown me how to change a tire. The man who once drove 40 minutes in sleet because my college car would not start. That was the difficult part nobody liked to admit about family betrayal. People could be loving in one memory and unforgivable in another. One did not erase the other. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I know. He looked at me. That answer seemed to hurt more than if I had said I had no choice. Because I did have a choice. I was making it. He put the level into a box. Your mother thinks you'll change your mind. I know. I told her not to count on it. That was as close as he came to admitting he believed me. Diane still did not. Instead, she prepared one last performance. 3 days before the move, Aunt Carol called. Your mother invited people over on Saturday. What people? Family. I closed my eyes. For what? She says if she's being forced out, everyone should see it. Of course. For weeks, Diane had been losing control of the private version of the story, so she was going to turn the move itself into evidence. Morgan evicted her parents. Morgan watched them pack. Morgan stood there while her elderly mother left the family home. If she could not win the facts, she would win the image. Are you coming? I asked Carol. Yes. Why? Because I think somebody needs to be there who isn't pretending this is simple. That was fair. Saturday morning arrived clear and brutally cold. The storm season was mostly over, but winter had not finished with Minnesota. I left Lucy with my friend. I did not want her anywhere near the final scene. When I turned into the driveway, there were already 4 cars parked along the curb. Aunt Carol, my uncle, 2 cousins. Kenneth's truck sat near the garage, loaded with boxes. The front of the in-law suite was lined with sealed containers and furniture, wrapped in moving blankets. My father was carrying a toolbox toward the truck. Diane stood on the steps in a long winter coat. The moment she saw me, her posture changed. Straighter, sharper, ready. Good, she said. You're here. I got out of the car. Aunt Carol gave me a small nod. Nobody smiled. Kenneth kept moving boxes. Diane stepped down one stair. Everyone should see what you're doing. I looked at her. What I'm doing? You're making your parents leave the home they spent 30 years building. No one said anything. She wanted me to defend myself. I could feel it. That old reflex was still there. Explain. Clarify. Prove I was not cruel. Make everyone comfortable. Then one of my cousins looked at me and asked, Morgan, are you really going to make your parents leave? Diane's face changed slightly. Not much. Just enough. She thought the question had trapped me. Maybe 5 years earlier, it would have. Maybe even 5 weeks earlier. But standing there, with my father's boxes packed, and my mother waiting for me to choose between a boundary and being seen as a good daughter, I finally recognized the trap for what it was. And this time, I had no intention of stepping into it. My cousin's question hung in the cold air for a moment, but I did not rush to fill it. That had been one of my mother's most reliable advantages over me for years. She would create an emotional scene, someone else would ask whether I was really willing to hurt the family, and I would start explaining until my own boundaries sounded unreasonable. This time, I just looked at the people standing in my driveway and said, their month-to-month occupancy ended under written notice. They already have another apartment. Nobody is being put on the street. Diane gave a short laugh. Listen to her. Month-to-month occupancy. That's what 30 years of family means to her now. No, I said. That's what the housing arrangement means. You're punishing us over one bad night. I heard Aunt Carol exhale beside me, but I kept my eyes on my mother. One bad night doesn't explain the boxes that were already here. It doesn't explain Dad changing the code before Lucy's bus arrived. It doesn't explain you knowing her school was dismissing early. Diane turned toward the others as if I had proved her point. She's turned everything into a case file. I could have answered that. I could have listed the timestamps, the messages, the old equity loan, the months of planning, every contradiction. Instead, I said, I don't need everyone here to agree with me. That unsettled her more than an argument would have. She pointed toward the house. Lucy wasn't outside that long. She was never in real danger. Before I could respond, Kenneth stopped loading the truck. He was standing beside a stack of plastic bins with one hand resting on a toolbox. For several seconds, he looked at Diane. Then at me. We knew she was at the door, he said. Diane turned sharply. Ken. He did not look at her. We knew. The driveway went completely quiet. My father swallowed. I saw her. I thought she'd go around to the garage. Then Diane said to leave it alone because Morgan would be home eventually. That is not what happened, my mother snapped. Kenneth finally looked at her. Yes, it is. Then he looked at me. I should have opened the door. It was the first time he had said it without wrapping it in weather, confusion, Brittany, or my mother. I did not know whether to feel relieved or furious. Mostly I felt tired. Thank you for saying it, I said. Diane stared at both of us as if we had betrayed her together. My father reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the keys to the suite. Then he took the garage remote from his truck and handed both to me. I think that's everything. I'll check the handover list. He nodded. No dramatic gesture, no throwing keys into the snow. Just a transfer of access that should have happened without an audience. Kenneth glanced back at the house. I built half this place with my own hands. I know. He studied my face, waiting for something else. Maybe gratitude. Maybe guilt. Maybe an invitation to stay. I had already given him the truth. I knew what he had built. I knew what the house had meant to him. None of that changed what he had done with the authority I trusted him to have. Diane stepped between us. Lucy is going to remember this. I looked at her. She's going to remember that her mother threw her grandparents away because she was angry. Lucy remembers the door. Her mouth opened.
At the time, it had seemed like a small favor. One of many. He clicked, cancel. The page processed for a moment before confirming the refund, $3,800, deposited back to his account within 5 to 7 business days. He moved on to his banking app, found the transfer record from 3 weeks prior, $6,500 wired to Marilyn's account, marked as wedding gift honeymoon support. He reversed it.
Stop paying. I did not mean money alone. I meant the price of being the reliable daughter who was expected to convert everyone else's choices into manageable consequences. My mother understood that. Maybe that was why she did not answer. The move took another 2 hours. Nobody applauded when my parents left. Nobody hugged me and told me I had been right all along. Aunt Carol helped Kenneth secure a dresser in the truck. One cousin carried a box. Diane refused my help, which was fine with me. Then they drove away. Their new apartment was 15 minutes from the house. 2 bedrooms, decent parking, close to a grocery store and Kenneth's pharmacy. It was smaller than the place they had enjoyed for years, but it was not a punishment cell. It was simply what they could afford without a daughter subsidizing the difference between what they had and what they felt entitled to keep. Diane continued telling some relatives that I had chosen money over family. I stopped caring. Once people had the facts, what they chose to believe was their responsibility. Kenneth changed in a smaller way. A few months later, I received a letter from him. It was short. No excuses. No request to come back. He wrote that he had spent too much time thinking of the house as something I had taken over instead of something I had saved when he could no longer keep it. He said he had let his pride turn into permission. Then he wrote one sentence about Lucy. I knew she was outside. I failed her. I read the letter twice and put it away. I did not throw it out. I also did not hand him a key. An apology could be real without restoring access. Brittany got the logistics job she had interviewed for. She did not love it at first. She complained about fixed hours, office meetings, and having someone else approve her vacation days. She kept a few staging clients on weekends and sold enough inventory to stop paying storage costs. For the first time in years, she built her life around what she actually earned. We did not suddenly become close, but something shifted. One evening, Mom called me 3 times in a row. I ignored all 3. A few minutes later, Brittany texted, Mom keeps calling you. I told her to stop. You already said no. I stared at the message for a long time. That was not redemption. It was not an apology for every year of favoritism, but it was the first time I could remember Brittany telling our mother that my no did not require negotiation. I replied with 2 words. Thank you. The in-law suite stayed empty for months. I wanted it done properly. I had the electrical work inspected, repaired a bathroom exhaust issue, replaced locks, repainted, and handled the rental requirements before listing it. By July, I found a tenant. A middle school librarian who wanted a quiet place close to work. The first rent payment went into a separate account, part toward the mortgage, part toward emergency savings, part toward Lucy's college fund. There was something deeply satisfying about that. The same space that had once represented obligation was now helping build my daughter's future. By August, Lucy was doing much better. She still checked the door lock sometimes when we came home, especially if the weather was bad. I never told her not to. Trust did not return because an adult announced that everything was safe again. One evening, she sat on the kitchen counter while I packed leftovers. Are Grandma and Grandpa ever coming back? I knew she meant more than the house. I don't know. She frowned. Is that a bad answer? No, it's the honest one. She considered that. Then I said, they won't come back into your life unless being around them is safe for you. Lucy nodded as if that was enough for now. Later that week, I showed the new tenant how the suite entrance worked. She carried in a box of books, thanked me, and closed the door behind her. I stood outside for a moment and heard the lock click. For months, that sound had taken me back to Lucy standing on the porch, trying a code that no longer worked. This time, the sound meant something else. The person who belonged inside was inside. The person who owned the boundary had chosen it, and nobody was being left in the cold. You should never confuse being capable with being obligated to carry everyone else's consequences. Healthy families respect boundaries, ownership, safety, and the word no. When someone repeatedly ignores those limits, protect your children first, document what happened, follow the proper process, and stop rewarding harmful behavior with more access or support. Forgiveness does not require restoring the same privileges that were abused. You can care about relatives and still refuse to let them endanger your home, finances, or peace. If you value stories about family, accountability, and smart boundaries, subscribe to the channel for more.